From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is David Feldman, and I'm here with the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, David.
On the show today, we're going to be talking about poverty with journalist and author Loretta Scwartz-Nobel. That'll be in the second half. We'll also check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, the Thomas Magnum of the corporate crime beat. And if we have time, we will get to more of your listener questions. Steve Scroven is not with us today because he is in New York City pitching a docuseries about nuclear power, which is appropriate in light of our first guest, Peter Bradford, who is one of the foremost experts on the issues surrounding nuclear power. Professor Peter Bradford is a former commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the former chair of the New York and Maine Utility Regulatory Commissions. He has taught at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and is currently an adjunct professor at Vermont Law School, where he teaches nuclear power and public policy. He is vice chair of the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists and is the author of Fragile Structures, A Story of Oil Refineries, National Securities, and the Coast of Maine. His latest article is entitled When the Unthinkable is Deemed Impossible, Reflecting on Fukushima. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Peter Bradford.
Thanks for that very copious and thorough introduction. You did leave out one thing, which was my start in trying to develop a public interest perspective on many matters was as an original Rader in the late 60s.
Well,
Thank you for that, Ralph.
Yes, that's right. He was on the first team in the late 60s. Peter, let's start with some factual predicates here on nuclear power. Amory Lovins, who you know is a physicist and a longtime analyst of the superiority of sustainable energy over fossil fuels and nuclear power, has said in response to the advocates of nuclear power who are trying to resurrect the industry and say, well, this is good because nuclear power doesn't have greenhouse gases. It's good for thwarting climate change. And Amory Lovins came up with a very, very succinct rebuttal, which was, for the same amount of money that you have to invest in a giant 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, you can invest in solar energy, wind power, solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, or energy conservation, and get more energy that's safer, that's decentralized, that is insurable, that doesn't present national security targets, and get us into geopolitical problems abroad. And I have never seen the nuclear industry propagandists ever rebut that. Can you comment on that and give us your take on nuclear power in the United States today?
I think the reason you've never seen it rebutted is that it's essentially irrebuttable. And it's been true of nuclear power really since its glory years in the U.S. in the 1970s. That is, it's always been justified in the face of economic problems by saying that it's essential to some other larger goal, getting us off of oil in the 1970s, avoiding blackouts and brownouts in the 1980s, and today in the context of climate change. And it's always been true that there were other less expensive ways of attaining those same goals. So Amory's absolutely right, but he could have said it in other contexts, probably did say it in other contexts over the last 4 decades. Nuclear power today, especially with regard to the building of new plants, is essentially on the rocks. What was billed as a nuclear renaissance in 2000, 2001 has yet to displace its first molecule of carbon in the U.S. because none of the ballyhooed reactors of a decade ago have actually come online. And of the 31 license applications that were filed at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, only 4 are actually being built, together with a 5th plant in Tennessee, whose construction originally began in the mid-1970s and then was suspended for many years.
So how many nuclear plants are operating today? How many recently have been shut down? And what percent of our electricity in the United States comes from nuclear power?
I believe there are 99 plants operating today. 5 or 6 have been shut down, and another 3 are shutdown announcements have been made. This was a real surprise compared to the situation of 5 years ago when the operating plants were thought to be essentially cash cows for the owners, but the costs of the operating plants have risen pretty dramatically. The costs of alternatives, both renewables and natural gas, have fallen, and the demand for electricity hasn't grown at anywhere near the rate that the industry was projecting. So the plants actually are closing, and the industry is scrambling for very large subsidies in several states, Illinois, Ohio, and New York, first among them, in order to try and stave off still more shutdowns.
How many nuclear plants would have been in this country if it wasn't for government subsidies? Could you describe some of these subsidies? It's been called the government guaranteed industry.
Yes, I think that's fair. I'm not sure there'd be any nuclear plants operating in the U.S. today without subsidies. If you go back to the beginning of this industry, after all, it was born and nurtured in government laboratories essentially as part of the Manhattan Project. So the entire enrichment enterprise, the reactors themselves, were developed as government programs and then turned over to the private sector. In addition, in the 50s, the private sector was given very large incentives to build nuclear plants and benefited in addition from substantial tax incentives, accelerated depreciation, investment tax credits. And then on top of those more general benefits, it's had the benefit of the Price-Anderson Act, which limits its liability in the event of a nuclear accident to an amount that's escalated over the years and is now in the range of $13 billion. And it's had a second very large hidden subsidy in the form of the government's commitment to take the waste, the high-level waste, the spent fuel rods. Now, granted, the government hasn't been very successful in discharging that, but without that governmental commitment to take the waste, which is unique, I mean, no other industry has anything comparable to it, it's hard to imagine that any nuclear plants would have been built because no private enterprise would have been willing to take that liability on.
And what was the projection in the 70s? Listeners might be interested in knowing that there hasn't been a new license for a nuclear plant that has materialized into an operating nuclear plant providing electricity today since the early 1970s. So there's really been a moratorium because Wall Street won't fund these nuclear plants with loans without a virtual total government taxpayer guarantee. But tell the listeners what the optimistic projection by the nuclear industry, repeated by the Atomic Energy Commission, as to how many nuclear plants there is going to be in the U.S. by the year 2000, which is 16 years ago. There are now 99 operating.
Right. The high estimate that I'm aware of was 1,000 reactors by the year 2000, and that projection was made by the Atomic Energy Commission in 1972, and in fact was stitched into President Nixon's Project Independence, the first of many Project Independences that didn't actually produce independence.
That would have meant 100 nuclear plants in California, up and down the coast, imagine that. And now in California, there's only one left, and David Freeman assures me, the former head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, that one is going to be closing pretty soon. So California somehow manages to get along without any nuclear plants except the one that's about to be shut down.
It's actually a 2-unit site at Diablo Canyon, so 2 plants.
Yes. And, of course, there's always been the earthquake risk. Can you describe that in terms of Indian Point's reactors 30 miles north of Manhattan Island in New York and California and elsewhere? Could you describe that peril?
The earthquake risk associated with nuclear plants, of course, has been demonstrated for the world to see at Fukushima, at least when combined with a large tsunami. In the U.S., not all plants have anything like the exposure of the Japanese plants. But there is a troubling situation in that a lot of the plants were licensed at a time when the seismology of various parts of the U.S. was less well understood than it is today, and in some cases were approved and built to standards somewhat lower than what we think now believe the maximum earthquake that they could confront might be. Diablo Canyon is the plant probably most exposed to earthquake situations because of the discovery of additional faults around and close to that site.
Did you discuss what the maximum scenario of a nuclear plant disaster could be, whether it's sabotage or whether it's internal controls failing or earthquake? I think the Atomic Energy Commission came out in the 1950s and 60s with some estimate of what level of damage could occur with a Class 9, as they used to call it, nuclear meltdown.
I'm not sure I remember precisely, but it was in the neighborhood of 3,000 deaths, several $billion in damage, and the rendering uninhabitable of an area the size of the state of Pennsylvania. If you updated those estimates to today's dollars, of course, the property damage amounts would be much higher. The populations around a number of reactor sites are higher now than they were then, so the fatalities possibilities might also go up. Indian Point is the poster child for the siting of a reactor in a place that probably should never have been approved, almost certainly would not have been approved under the standards that were developed once evacuation planning was a requirement after the accident at 3 Mile Island. Because so many people live within a 25-mile radius, essentially all of New York City, and you remember the unforgettable television images on September 11th, 2001 of the smoke from the Trade Center. It was blowing from north to south. That is, if it had been an Indian Point type of accident in that wind, it would have been carried directly to New York City.
And of course, with the Atomic Energy Commission itself, a promoter of nuclear power, saying an area the size of Pennsylvania might be uninhabitable, that would mean that an accident in Indian Point could make the whole greater New York City area uninhabitable. And I might add, you remember Attorney General Cuomo and then Senator Hillary Clinton urged that Indian Point be shut down. I mean, if two politicians who are very cautious could say that, what are the problems with Indian Point? What are the specific problems?
The fundamental problem is the site itself, and I think they'd say also the age of the reactor. What Fukushima shows, and indeed the other major accidents also, is that it's a mistake to try to predict exact accident sequences and probabilities, because the types of accidents you get turn out always to be outside of the parameters of those exercises. What's troublesome about Indian Point is where it is. And of course, as plants get older, they require a lot more care and maintenance and surveillance. None of this is to say that an accident is a likely event. I think you have to say, looking at the overall record of nuclear power, that a specific accident at a specific site is not all that likely. But to take that risk with regard to a plant located that close to New York City, it's not been appealing to a number of top officials in New York State for a number of years.
And it's
incidentally why Mario Cuomo was so strongly opposed to the Shoreham facility on Long Island, which in fact never did operate.
The Indian Point plants are right on the Hudson River, and anti-nuclear advocates once, or maybe twice, they got into a motorboat and they motored right up to the shore before any of the security knew what was happening, just in order to test that the guard level at these nuclear plants has left something to be desired. Before we go to your article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we're talking with Peter Bradford, who teaches law at Vermont Law School and who was a former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Tell our listeners what evacuation plans have to be filed and what's the nature of these evacuation plans around nuclear plants and whether there's actually been any testing of these population evacuation plans.
Well, there certainly has never been a test in which the public has been an active participant. The drills are limited to activities by the so-called first responders. There's never been the equivalent of a fire drill. And as a result, it's very hard to know how successful one would actually be. The actual evacuation at 3 Mile Island was a very limited one, a subset of the population within just a few miles of the reactor. Now utilities are required to have plans out to a 10-mile radius, but we know from Fukushima and other events that in a really serious accident, the concern would be for a much larger area, depending on the, among other things, on the wind and weather conditions. And there's a pretty high likelihood that an evacuation of that sort at a heavily populated site would not go smoothly. The NRC, in the context of Shoreham and Seabrook in the late 80s, developed something it called the realism rule, but a number of us think of as the surrealism rule. And the gist of that rule is that even if county officials refuse to take part in preparing and carrying out an evacuation plan because they object to a reactor site, the NRC will assume that in a real emergency, they would still carry out their duties and would be able to do so smoothly, even though they had no hand in preparing the plan and had never been involved in rehearsing it. And that seems to me, frankly, to be sheer nonsense.
When I ask atomic energy officials in the government about why they don't have drills, how do they know these evacuation plans are going to work? They're supposed to be filed in accessible institutions like libraries near nuclear power plants. And they basically say they don't want to alarm the public. But what they're really saying is, hey, you can hardly evacuate New York City at rush hour time. Imagine trying to evacuate a portion of that city with the sirens and with the fear of a nuclear cloud, radioactive cloud heading their way. Mr. Bradford mentioned the Shoreham plant. The Shoreham was a multi-billion-dollar plant. I think these plants now are going for 12 to 14 billion a year, but the Shoreham plant was a huge plant on Long Island, and it was completed. And then when the question was asked, could the people around that plant be adequately evacuated, they couldn't demonstrate that it could be. And tell me, am I correct, Mr. Bradford, that the reason why the plant closed was because there wasn't an adequate evacuation plan, but somehow the Long Island Electric Company contaminated it by starting it up for a few days. And so this giant plant had to be amortized on the backs of ratepayers in the greater Long Island area. So the customers paid and are still paying for that plant. Is that a proper characterization?
You have the economics right. The role of emergency planning was a little different. That is, Long Island officials and Governor Mario Cuomo at that time, the late 1980s, maintained that you could not successfully carry out an evacuation, and therefore they refused to have any part in emergency planning. That's when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission developed this so-called realism rule, and they approved a low power license for the plant on the basis that emergency planning would be carried out successfully if there were a real emergency, even though the state had refused to take any part in preparing for it. Under that low power license, the plant did indeed run for about a week, and as a result, there were low levels of radioactive contamination in the plant systems, and the decommissioning of the plant was considerably more expensive than it would have been otherwise. The plant was actually shut down as a result of a settlement between the Long Island Lighting Company and the state of New York, in which the plant was sold to the Long Island Power Authority for $1. But the Long Island Lighting Company was able to recover a large part of its investment in building it. And as you say, it was a multi-billion dollar, about a $5 billion undertaking in the dollars of 1989.
We've been talking to Professor Peter Bradford, who teaches law at Vermont Law School, former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and former chair of both the New York and Maine electric utility regulatory agencies. He's got a lot of experience. I have to mention, Peter, before we go to your article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists titled When the Unthinkable is Deemed Impossible, reflecting on Fukushima, that you and I and the former Prime Minister of Japan, after the Fukushima disaster, and some other experts on nuclear power had a news conference close to Indian Point, north of Manhattan, and there was an enormous amount of compelling information, and it was never covered by the New York Times or the local television stations in New York City. Yet you have a botched explosive in Times Square a few years ago, and it commands the news day after day after day. Fortunately, nobody was injured. How do you explain this collective denial syndrome, both by the media and by too many government officials and utility executives?
I can't explain the Times not covering it in any other way than the Times has always had seems to me to be a pro-nuclear bias, not in their day-to-day reporting necessarily. They've had a lot of good stories. I think back to when David Burnham was covering the Silkwood case, he was probably the lead journalist pursuing that. But they just can't quite seem to wean themselves from a feeling that somehow nuclear power tomorrow will be better than it's been up to now. And so, I don't know, maybe that had something to do with their decisions that day. I hadn't actually realized that the Times and the TV stations didn't cover that. Kind of extraordinary, because not only did it include the former Prime Minister of Japan, but it included Greg Jaczko, who'd been the recent chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
What's interesting
Say nothing of you with me.
Yeah, what's interesting, the longtime reporter on nuclear power, Matthew Wald, who everybody knows, and out of Washington, D.C. for the New York Times, retired recently, went to work for a nuclear industry group. At any rate, let's go to your article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Can you tell our listeners the essence of it, especially the item-by-item recounting that you have in this marvelously compressed and factual article, and why did you write it?
Well, the Bulletin had a series on sort of Fukushima after 5 years and asked me to submit a piece, and that one was the result, and thanks for the kind words. That essence of that list was to point out the number of events that had been deemed impossible or virtually impossible by regulatory agencies over the years that occurred within a very short time during the accident in Fukushima. So starting with an earthquake of that magnitude and a tsunami of that height, but then also progressing on to the loss of off-site power combined with the failure of the emergency on-site generators. So the ability to cool the reactors was lost. The meltdown of 3 units within a very short period of time, the release of large quantities of radiation from the containment and then off-site, the discussion of the evacuation of Tokyo with its 25 million people if the wind had changed direction, so the radiation hadn't mostly blown out to sea. And then on top of that, the second list essentially was of the consequences for nuclear power of the set of events that accompanied those so-called virtually impossible events, all of which had happened. And that list included, of course, the destruction on live television of 1% of the world's nuclear capacity within a few days, and the exposure of substantial numbers of people to levels of radiation, the need to evacuate more than 100,000 people, most of whom left as a result of government instructions, 100,000 of whom have not been able to move back 5 years later. Ultimately, the termination of what had been a pretty highly respected regulatory agency, the fall of the government that had been in office during the accident. So consequences of considerable magnitude, many of them outside of human health effects, but the kinds of consequences that get taken into the calculations of politicians and governments as they decide what level of support to extend to nuclear power going forward. And nuclear power, as we've discussed, always needs a large amount of governmental support. Instead, what you saw here was several countries, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, deciding to phase out their new programs.
And Taiwan.
Taiwan also. Yeah.
Another one was the Japanese government had to close all 54 of Japan's nuclear plants, with only a few having resumed operations as of now, 2016, and 10 are being considered permanently closed. This is what we're going to face should we, God forbid, have a nuclear disaster on that scale in the U.S. And who would be prosecuted? Who would go to jail? Who would be held accountable? What's the answer to that one, other than the local janitor?
Let me take that point in a somewhat different direction, and then we can come back to those questions. In the context of this discussion of nuclear power as being an essential bulwark against climate change, when you look at that sudden shutdown of the 50 Japanese reactors and the decision of other countries to pull back altogether from it, how effective a bulwark can nuclear possibly be if it's always vulnerable to some one catastrophic event which will result in a substantial number of the world's reactors being closed? That's really not a very secure bulwark against climate change, because I think it's highly likely that from time to time, and God knows one hopes it's not with any frequency, but from time to time there are going to be these events. And so you're then stuck with a bulwark against climate change that you may not be able to rely on at all. There is no other energy technology that's vulnerable to widespread shutdowns, no other low-carbon energy technology that's vulnerable to widespread shutdowns of remotely that sort.
And I understand that in recent years in the United States, more new generating capacity for electricity is coming out of renewables than even out of new fossil fuel systems.
I think that's right, especially if you combine renewables with the amount of energy being saved by energy efficiency programs.
Right. You know, when I'm asked about atomic energy, all I have is a soundbite. We're talking with Peter Bradford, former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I have a whole series of uns. It's nuclear power is unnecessary. It's uninsurable by the private market. It's unfinanceable by Wall Street without a taxpayer guarantee. It's unsafe. It's unevacuable. And it is vulnerable to national security peril in terms of sabotage. And yet, because it's government guaranteed, atomic energy electric executives are going along with asking for licenses for new plants. I'm told over the years that these heads of electric powers really don't like nuclear power. It's too much of a headache, produces too much risk, peril, too much community opposition. Why are even a few of them going into this area, Peter Bradford, given what they know about the headaches?
I think there's one aspect of the government guarantee that you need to stir in to get a clearer picture of that, and that's that it's not just a taxpayer guarantee. It's that the states in which new reactors are being built, Georgia and South Carolina, have passed laws that require the customers to start paying for the reactors years before the plants will actually come into service. That's completely different from historic utility rate setting. And not only to pay for the reactors, but to pay the utilities a profit on investment in the reactors. So in the most preposterous of those situations, you had the reactor that was being built by a company called Florida Progress in North Florida at Levy County. It's now Duke Energy, but it was at that time Florida Progress. That reactor was canceled after $1 billion and some dollars had been spent on it, and yet these laws require the customers to pay every penny of that amount plus a profit to the utility for having failed to build a reactor and blowing $1 billion of customers' money in the course of the attempt. It's that ability in the states that use that kind of regulation to augment the utility rate base and thereby increase its profitability that I think accounts for the popularity of nuclear power for the Southern Company.
This kind of imposition on you, the ratepayer, you have to pay for electricity that you're not even getting. You think that would be a constitutional question. That occurs because the Florida legislature, under the heel of the electric company industry lobbyists, passed that requirement.
That's right.
And it's
fact,
called
during the speakership of Marco Rubio and the governorship of Jeb Bush.
Yeah, never raised, by the way, during the debates with the Republican presidential candidates when Marco Rubio was up for evaluation as one of the candidates. I always ask some of my guests, Peter Bradford, the following sequential questions before you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you if they want to give you some feedback. And that is, have you ever been in the last 3-4 years on any NPR show, PBS show, or a network TV show nationally?
After the accident at Fukushima, so if we stretch the 4 to 5, I was pretty popular for a while. But that's trailed off, and so I would say probably not in the last 3 years.
So, listeners, this is what we're going to highlight on May 24th at Constitution Hall. We're going to raise the question of how can we get more serious content over commercial radio, commercial TV, and commercial cable networks for such issues such as you've been hearing about today. My view is we've had enough trivia and corporate hedonism and redundant programming on our own property, the public airways, where we have to do something about it. And we're going to bring a lot of authors and filmmakers and musicians and poets and reporters and other people together to form a new group in order to get more serious content before the people of this country. Peter Bradford, tell our listeners in conclusion how they can reach you and what other materials you've written that they could read.
Well, my email address is perubrad@AOL.com. And I've had a couple of other articles in the last 6 months in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And beyond that, a scattering of articles in op-ed pieces and book reviews and the like. And I guess the best way to dig them out is just to Google me. There are some listed that if you go to the Vermont Law School website, especially for the Institute for Energy and the Environment, some of the other articles that I've written, I believe, are linked through there.
Thank you very much, Peter Bradford, a powerful voice for our country to wind down nuclear power and replace it with far more efficient, safe, and reliable decentralized solar energy and energy conservation. To be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph, and for all that you've done over the decades.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking with Professor Peter Bradford, former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and now adjunct professor at Vermont Law School. His latest article is When the Unthinkable is Deemed Impossible, Reflecting on Fukushima. As always, we will link to all of the relevant material on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. Coming up next, we're going to speak to author and journalist Loretta Scwartz-Nobel about the state of poverty in America. But first, let's find out what the big boys are doing this week from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 15, 2016. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Federal regulators Wednesday confirmed that watchdogs have been warning for years. The biggest banks in the United States are still too big to fail. The Federal Reserve and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation found that 5 major U.S. banks failed to offer credible strategies for how they would enter bankruptcy in an orderly fashion without taking the whole economy down with them. The Dodd-Frank law gave regulators the power and responsibility to protect the American people from the dangers posed by Wall Street's too-big-to-fail banks. Requiring them to have credible living wills is an essential part of achieving that, although much else remains to be done by all the financial regulators, said Dennis Kelleher of Better Markets. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. We're now going to turn to the topic of poverty in America, and to do that, we're going to talk to someone who has made its elimination her life's work. Loretta Scwartz-Nobel is a journalist, writer, and advocate for disadvantaged families in America. Dr. Schwartz-Nobel achieved national acclaim for her article in the Christmas 1974 issue of Philadelphia Magazine, in which she brought attention to the hardships of the poor and destitute living in Philadelphia. That article won the 1975 Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for outstanding coverage of the problems of the disadvantaged. In 1981, she wrote her first novel, Starving in the Shadow of Plenty, focusing especially on the difficulty of obtaining food and the ineffectuality of government welfare programs. Her newest book is called Poisoned Nation, which links the soaring epidemics of cluster illness to the chemical contamination of our water, air, food, and everyday products. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Loretta Scwartz-Nobel.
Hi, thank you very much.
And welcome to Loretta. I was a real fan of your book, Growing Up Empty, The Hunger Epidemic in America. It wasn't that I didn't know about hunger in America. It was the way you wrote the book with such human interest and tragedy, and talking about real people and what hunger does to families and neighborhoods and communities. And Senator Edward Kennedy has this to say about your book. Loretta Scwartz-Nobel's Growing Up Empty is a forceful reminder of the great shame in our society that hunger still plagues millions of Americans. She puts a human face on hunger around us and shines a moral spotlight on a problem that's largely ignored. More than just a forceful call to action, Schwartz-Nobel has issued a mandate for reform, end quote. Now, that was about 13 years ago. Has much changed in this country? And is there still many millions of children who go to bed hungry at night? And what's the cause of all this in a land of plenty?
Well, those are several big questions all wrapped into one, and I'll do my best to kind of take them apart and try to tell you.
Go right ahead.
Try to give you a sense of what I think happened and is happening. In 1967, taking you back away, hunger was really first, quote unquote, discovered. That is to say, it first became a political issue. And that was when Robert Kennedy Jr. Was in the Mississippi Delta with another senator named Robert Clark, looking at poverty in America. And at that time, he came across shack after shack after shack, and inside these shacks were people with literally nothing to eat. And he was most touched by the sight of a little 2-year-old girl and her mother, whose name was Annie White, I believe. The child was so damaged by having no food, she was just sort of rubbing a couple of grains of rice around on the ground and couldn't speak. And Robert Kennedy was so moved, and so was Senator Clark, by what they saw at that time, that they went back to Washington and began a battle for food aid that really exists and has never stopped existing up until today, 2016. So it's it's 49 years. Next April, it will mark 50 years of a struggle that's gone back and forth and back and forth. And essentially, every time there's enough of an outcry, there's a rise in benefits that the government provides for its poorer people. But every time there's an improvement in hunger, there are others that come along and cut the programs. And naturally, this is all affected by what's happening in the economy at any given time and the population. But the general struggle for food aid reform has never really stopped in the last 49 years. What has changed enormously is public awareness and public response.
Indicate to our listeners the nature of these benefits. Are you talking about food stamps only or more special programs for infants and toddlers?
Yes, Ralph, I'm talking about anything that relates to food. And there have been many food aid reform programs that directly distribute food to the hungry, and those have been enormously valuable. But because hunger is linked to poverty, things like welfare were also, or aid to families with dependent children, which increased or provided income for people who were struggling seriously. Those things help, too, to enable people to provide food for their kids. So it's programs like food stamps, welfare, WIC, later on free breakfasts, free lunches, and similar programs that have helped actually get food to kids who otherwise would have been living in third world conditions, essentially.
And does this hunger come from the fact that they're single mom families, unemployed moms, underemployed, people who have no income security whatsoever? The estimate I heard is that between 13 and 15 million children go to bed hungry at night. How do they measure that? And why are they using this phrase, food insecure people, instead of hunger?
Well, right. Food insecurity is a more comfortable term for the government to put out there than actual hunger. And I think the current statistics are saying there are about 15 million kids who don't get enough food. And that's a pretty amazing number because given the fact that there are now some fairly effective free breakfast, I'd say very effective free breakfast and free lunch programs that are available to some kids, it's still not enough. And the thing about public policy food aid programs isn't that they're not effective, but that they don't go far enough. And hunger can affect, as you just said, the underemployed, the unemployed, the migrant, the refugee, the middle-class person whose husband has walked out and has suddenly stopped paying support, and suddenly a person who was formerly okay finds herself or sometimes himself suddenly without enough resources to feed their children. It can affect the military people, especially at the lower levels, who have been led to believe that if they are part of the government military program, the government will take care of them and their families, and then find that their salaries aren't high enough. So you've got soldiers who are fighting on the front lines, and their wives and children are standing on the bread lines. And in many cases, it's only those bread lines, those soup kitchens, those food pantries, and those other wonderful grassroots organizations, and last I heard there were over 140,000 of them now, that make the difference between true poverty and quote-unquote food insecurity. And I think you asked about this concept of food insecurity, and what that means is today, with the organizations that exist, a lot of people can find a way to get something to eat. They can go out to McDonald's and buy some French fries or a 99-cent hamburger or make popcorn, so that those kids, you wouldn't call them starving in the way that the children that Robert Kennedy found were starving, but they're not nourished. They're not adequately nourished. And that alone can affect everything in their lives, from their scholastic performance to their sense of themselves and to what they grow up to be.
We've been talking to Loretta Scwartz-Nobel, the author of Growing Up Empty, The Hunger Epidemic in America. When I give this book to people from Western European countries, such as Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, which I've done from time to time, their eyes bulge out when they read about the great sweep of hunger in this country, the land of the free, home of the brave, supposedly the richest country in the world. And so I asked them, well, you don't have any kind of hunger like this with children and others in your country? And they said, of course not. We have all kinds of social safety nets. We never have to get, except in a few circumstances, down to the level of food kitchens and soup kitchens. How do you explain all this?
Well, essentially, I think it's a question of attitude. It's a question of having an open heart versus a kind of a closed heart. I mean, we see it reflected today in, the concept of Donald Trump's building walls, not bridges, between human beings. And that's an attitude. That's a huge, huge problem in America, and it always has been. For some people, there's a moment of epiphany, like when Robert Kennedy saw these hungry children and went and began a fight for food aid reform. And for a while it worked. Begrudgingly, there was an increase in food policy. But at the political level, as soon as things get a little better, Reagan, for example, cut the food stamp budget by $12 billion. And again, people felt it. They got hungry. More and more of them got hungry. There was greater and greater need. Bush claimed that hunger had more to do with troubled lives than a troubled economy. Clinton established the welfare to work policies. Obama has just signed a bill into law taking people who are, quote unquote, able-bodied and not working off of food stamps if they haven't found a job within 3 months. But of course, if they do find a job within 3 months, that job will disqualify them from getting benefits because their income will be, quote, too high. So there is an idea somehow politically in America that the poor are a burden to the rest of the society rather than that they're valuable members, that they're part of this endless chain of humanity that makes us all one people, all one family. And when you've got people who are constantly thinking of themselves rather than of a family of humanity, you've got this kind of attitude. And unfortunately, public aid programs in America are so damaging to the dignity of the people who seek them, oftentimes, not always, I'm sure, but oftentimes, that some people would almost rather, not accept them than be humiliated and degraded by having their children know or by begging for help from bureaucrats who are really looking for ways to get them out of the program. And they have so much red tape. A hungry person really can't wait till they bring back more and more proof that they're hungry. And homeless people, for example, are often not given help because they don't have a permanent address. But if they had a permanent address, they might not be in the position where they needed help. So there's a round of red tape that's really designed not to help, but to hurt the poor.
And, the listeners might be interested in knowing there are over 45 million Americans in this country on food stamps. Over 45 million. Let me conclude with this question to you. It may be uncomfortable for you to answer this. We're talking with Loretta Scwartz-Nobel, author of the Growing Up Empty book, gripping book, subtitled The Hunger Epidemic in America. Shame on us, by the way. At the same time, corporate welfare is gushing out of Washington, D.C., hundreds of billions of dollars a year to rich corporations, corporate welfare, handouts, giveaways, bailouts. And it's the same time that Walmart workers are taught by management how to file for food stamps because you can't get paid enough to support their family. And the head of Walmart is making over $11,000 an hour, 8 hours a day. And Walmart just spent $50 billion in stock buybacks to shore up the basis for the stock options for the top executives. You see the insanity? You see the insanity here? Let me put this question to you. Compared to Western European countries and Canada, is it fair to say that the USA, in its collective presence, directly and indirectly, is the cruelest country toward its own children of all other Western countries and Canada?
It's not an easy question for me to answer because I don't have enough familiarity with how all those children and people are treated. But I certainly can say that what we have done in America is inexcusable. And I can only say that the fact that 140,000 grassroots organizations and counting, there are many more, I'm sure, that exist, shouldn't have to exist. They are running out of food. That what we're doing to people in America, we're living in a divided country. And, you know, I think some of the political policies are as cruel as they can get. And it is a tragedy. And I'm now planning to write yet a third book on hunger in America. And the reason is that we haven't solved the problem. But I do believe that there are enough good people out there and enough people in power, too. I mean, people like Robert Kennedy and his brothers and probably Bernie Sanders, who genuinely object to this kind of income inequality, who genuinely care about other people, not just about becoming forever richer themselves. So for that reason, I mean, I think we can't stop. I think we have to create that moment of awareness in people where they reach out, where they understand that they can make a difference. Every single one of us can make a difference. Sometimes that difference can save one life. Sometimes it can assist or save thousands. It's always worth the effort.
It certainly isn't for a lack of food. We waste over 25% of our food easily in this country, and it's a matter of distribution of the food, of people having adequate income, adequate financial stability. And the difference between justice and charity is a soup kitchen, and justice is providing an economy that can sustain people with decent livelihoods so they don't need to go to food kitchens. And I think what you're talking about, Loretta Scwartz-Nobel, is that we need more justice, so we'll have to require less charity. The book is Growing Up Empty. Yes, the book is Growing Up Empty, The Hunger Epidemic in America. It's a gripping book. We look forward to your next book and having you on the show. Thank you very much. Tell our listeners how they can contact you.
Yes, thank you for adding that, because as I said earlier, I'm at the start of a new research project, and if you have a story that you want me to hear, whether you're on the side of people, whether you're one of the people living with hunger and poverty, or whether you're one of those trying to help them, contact me, and I will try to tell your story. I will try to come out and see you if it's possible, and you can reach me on my email. A good email address for me would be askloretta@aol.com. So that's ASKLORETTA@AOL.com. I'd love to hear your stories and tell them to others.
That's askloretta@aol.com. Thank you very much, Loretta Scwartz-Nobel. To be continued.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look
You're welcome.
forward to it.
Bye-bye now.
We've been speaking with journalist Dr. Loretta Scwartz-Nobel, author of Growing Up Empty and Poison Nation, and many other works that seek to shine light on the stain of poverty in the richest country in the world. We will link to all of her writings on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. Ralph, we got time for some listener questions.
Okay.
Ralph, our first listener question comes from Yvonne DiMarino. She writes, can you please discuss and explain the delegate system the DNC is using on your next show? I'm a lawyer, and I don't understand the algorithm they're using, and my fellow lawyer friends don't either. I can't get a straight answer from anyone with the nitty-gritty particulars of the equation. Of egregious example, when Bernie won Wyoming by 12 points, why were the delegates split 50-50 with Hillary? He won 7 delegates, and she won 7 delegates, plus another 4 superdelegates. I might as well move to Venezuela with this kind of election rigging. I feel like the DNC is counting on my being busy and distracted, but I'm tired of it.
Well, it's a complicated question, and a lot of people don't know the answer, including me, because the internal workings of the delegate process are very vulnerable to the pressure of which candidate the party supremacists want really to win and which ones they want to defeat. And so since the Democratic Party is a private corporation, they are immune from any constitutional challenge under the state action doctrine. But in the Democratic Party, 20 to 25% of all the delegates, over 2,000 of them, are superdelegates. They are not elected. They are usually members of Congress, governors, prominent party officials. And this was instituted so that never again would the Democratic Party nominate someone as progressive as George McGovern, Senator George McGovern. And it has worked to the benefit of the party entrenched establishment to make sure that even within the Democratic Party, there's not a progressive challenger. Now, having said that, the requirement that delegates have to reflect the votes of the party and in crossover primaries, independent voters in a particular state primary is very loosely defined. The delegates can change their minds, and nobody can really stop them. And that's what happened for Barack Obama in 2008. A lot of the superdelegates changed their minds. They were for Hillary early, and then they switched to Barack Obama. The whole process is secret. There are no transcripts. There's no public appeal. It's a disgraceful example of dictatorial power by one of the major two parties in our country. Now, Donald Trump has a legitimate beef. He's watching the Republican Party rules strip him of delegates that he should have had in states such as Wyoming, North Dakota, Colorado, and maybe other states. The bottom line, Yvonne, is that when the party establishment has got its back up against the wall by an approaching, challenging candidate inside the party, they will resort to theft.
George McGovern wrote the rules after 1968, didn't he?
Yes, and they were revised after his loss to Nixon in 1972. Revised to have these superdelegate controls and barriers.
That's our show. I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Peter Bradford, who writes and teaches about nuclear power issues, and also to Dr. Loretta Scwartz-Nobel and her ongoing fight against poverty in America. All of the links for our guests will be posted on the RalphNaderRadioHour.com, along with a transcript of this episode. Join us next week when we'll be speaking with activist Winona LaDuke, Executive Director of Honor the Earth and Ralph's former vice presidential running mate. She will be talking about her opposition to the routing of an oil pipeline through northern Minnesota. Thank you, Ralph. We'll talk to you next week.
And thank you, David. I want to note that our newest radio station picking up our show, WPKN in Bridgeport, a great community radio station. Those of you who are in the Bridgeport, New Haven area, run up Route 8 and visit the only law museum in the country, a compelling demonstration of the law of wrongful injury, which is designed to protect you in case you are wrongfully injured.